Hello, Mr. Hardy here, and in this video I would like to teach you about Chapter 6 of Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, titled Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. As per usual, I'll start by summarising the plot in this chapter. We'll then explore the key characters, context, themes and quotes together. And finally, I'll leave you with an exam-style question you can answer if you want to do some analytical writing practice. So, what happens in Chapter 6 of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, called Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon? Well, the search for Sir Carew Danvers' murderer, which we know as Mr. Hyde, is ongoing, but ultimately it's futile, it's pointless. The police aren't making any progress. Mr. Hyde seems to have completely disappeared. And in Mr. Hyde's absence, Dr. Jekyll has returned to his former self. He's hosting parties, he's being charitable, he's being a good Victorian gentleman again. Now at this stage we know that Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are linked, but readers reading the novella for the first time do not know this at this stage. They might be able to guess it, but it's not for certain. Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Lanyon and Mr. Utterson enjoy a party together, and it's like the good old days. The three friends are back together, their friendship is restored, everything seems to be going well. And then suddenly, soon afterwards, when Mr. Utterson goes to visit Dr. Jekyll, Poole, who is Jekyll's butler, denies Mr. Utterson access. And this really upsets Utterson. Things seem to be going back to normal, and now Dr. Jekyll has become a recluse. He won't see anyone again. So to get some answers, Mr. Utterson goes to visit Dr. Lanyon, but Dr. Lanyon has undergone a sudden change. In Chapter 2, we learn that Dr. Lanyon is quite a big, lively, healthy character, and now in Chapter 6, he has had a shock from which he will never recover. This sort of foreshadows his upcoming death. When asked about Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Lanyon says to Mr. Utterson that he wishes to hear no more of Dr. Jekyll. Confused, Mr. Utterson writes Dr. Jekyll a letter asking why has his friendship with Dr. Lanyon broken down. And Dr. Jekyll responds quite vaguely, saying that his relationship with Dr. Lanyon is incurable, and as a result he will lead a life of extreme seclusion from here on out. Soon afterwards, unfortunately and tragically, Dr. Lanyon dies. And after Lanyon's funeral, Mr. Utterson goes home to his office. He opens Dr. Lanyon's letter, which he's supposed to open after Dr. Lanyon's death. Now inside the letter there is another letter. Now letters are used by Stevenson as a tool for creating suspense and mystery. So now one letter's opened. Instead of the case being solved, there's another letter within. There is another mystery that we have to wait for, and it builds tension. This second letter mentions that it should not be opened until the death and or disappearance of Dr. Jekyll. Now that word disappearance in particular reminds Mr. Utterson of Jekyll's will that says the death or disappearance of Jekyll, all things should pass to Mr. Hyde. Now this wording makes Mr. Utterson suspect that Hyde is again manipulating not just Dr. Jekyll but also Dr. Lanyon. However, both letters are written in Dr. Lanyon's handwriting, so it wasn't Hyde who wrote it, clearly Lanyon wrote it. And this somehow links Jekyll, Hyde and Lanyon together in this mystery. But the problem is how, and this is what Utterson needs to solve, and what at this stage the readers really want to know the answer to in this detective novella. Utterson goes to visit Jekyll to get some answers face to face, but once again Poole the butler denies him entrance. In a way, Utterson says he's relieved, because if he had to spend time in that dark, intimidating room with Jekyll, who is clearly up to some strange behaviour and being reclusive, he might find it unnerving, so actually he finds it quite comfortable that Poole has denied him entrance. And there you go, that is the plot summary of Chapter 6, The Remarkable Incident of Dr. Lanyon. So let's take a deep dive into some of these characters at this stage of the novella. We have Mr. Utterson. He is our narrator, our protagonist, our hero, as it were, in this novella. we see Utterson is a really good friend. He's at his most happy when Jekyll and Lanyon and him are back together at parties, socialising together as they did. When Jekyll denies Utterson entrance into his house anymore, Utterson visits Lanyon. When Lanyon says he won't talk to Jekyll, Utterson tries to convince him. Utterson then becomes the middleman and even writes a letter to Jekyll trying to get answers. So we clearly see that to Utterson, friendship and loyalty are very important ideas, and this makes us as readers like him even more. We see Utterson as a detective, so I've mentioned before that you could classify this novella in the detective genre. We see everything through Utterson's eyes, so when he reads the letters, as readers we read the letters. When he visits Jekyll, as readers we visit Jekyll. So we are investigating the story and uncovering clues alongside Utterson. We see it from his perspective. We see that Utterson is a very professional lawyer. I don't think I could do this. Utterson has in his safe the letter of Lanyon that would answer all the questions. It would solve the mystery right then and there. All he has to do is read it. But out of respect for his profession, for being a professional, he does not open it until the conditions are met. So either Dr. Lanyon dies, and then when he opens that letter, he's not allowed to open the letter that was enclosed within it until Dr. Jekyll dies or disappears. So there's so much tension here. He has all the answers. The readers could have all the answers immediately, but Stevenson snatches it away because Utterson is very professional and won't open the letter until the conditions are met. For the first time in the novella, we see Utterson as afraid. This whole time he's been curious to get to the bottom of Mr. Hyde, and actually even when he's known Mr. Hyde was a murderer or suspected him of a murderer, we never saw Utterson get nervous, even when he went to Mr. Hyde's house with the police. However, for the first time we see he's afraid, and he actually admits to being relieved when Poole denies him entrance into Jekyll's house. Considering Utterson is our point of view, our narrator, what Utterson feels, as readers we feel. So Stevenson is, by making Utterson afraid, is making the readers feel a bit uncomfortable and afraid as well. So we have Dr. Lanyon, who this chapter is named after. The main takeaway from this is Lanyon undergoes a significant change, physically, mentally, spiritually. He's a changed man. So initially, when we first meet Lanyon in chapter 2, Stevenson presents him as a hearty, healthy, dapper, red-faced gentleman. If you look at all those adjectives, hearty, healthy, dapper, even red-faced, that colour having connotations of life, Lanyon is the perfect sort of Victorian gentleman. However, the shock he has undergone has left him in this chapter, chapter 6, with a death warrant written legibly upon his face. A death warrant is something a lawyer would sign for a criminal to be executed, so Lanyon knows his death is upcoming. We get further description of how the transformation has affected him. The rosy man had grown pale, his flesh had fallen away. Again, look at the colour connotation, rosy having sort of colour and life in his cheeks, and then have a look at that adjective pale, having a colourless, lifeless looking face. Dr. Lanyon took to his bed and was dead. That is a quote that tells us he ultimately died of his shock. Now, the reason he died of his shock is because he was a good man who witnessed something very evil, and he couldn't wrap his head spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically around what he witnessed. And this links to the theme of good versus evil. Looking at Jekyll, I want to put him alongside Hyde, because at this stage of the novella, chapter 6, it should become more and more apparent that Jekyll and Hyde are inseparable as characters. And if you've already studied this in class and you're using these videos to revise, you already know they are actually one and the same, just different facets of the same person. So Jekyll has become a recluse, living in what he calls extreme seclusion. Basically, he can't trust himself to go outside because Mr. Hyde is so strong he can take over Jekyll's body at any moment. When speaking of Hyde, the phrase "the dark influence of Hyde" is used. You could look at the connotations of that adjective dark Is it literal? Mr. Hyde only really comes out at night. He lives in the shadows of Blackmail House. Or is it a sort of symbolic darkness, going back to this idea of good versus evil, Hyde being dark, representing evil? That phrase, the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll, it's a bit of a foreshadow. Either he's going to die or he's going to disappear. Both are bad. Both leave or create a sense of mystery. How does he die? How does he disappear? Will he be found? That particular word, disappearance, is what triggers Mr. Utterson, because it reminds him of the will that Henry Jekyll gave him, that Mr. Utterson suspected Edward Hyde wrote. When referring to Mr. Hyde, this phrase, sinister suggestion of the man Hyde, you could maybe look at the alliteration of sinister suggestion, maybe even go as far to say sibilance of the S sound, maybe is indicative of like a snake, which again has connotations of evil, which you could link to the theme of good versus evil, and Hyde is a snake-like venomous character. As I mentioned earlier, at this stage of the novella, Jekyll and Hyde are really intertwined as characters, and as we later discover, they are one in the same. So, what context could be relevant at this stage of the novella? Well, I've already mentioned multiple times that you could argue The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde belongs in detective novel genre or detective fiction genre. I also want to offer up that it belongs in the Gothic horror genre. And on this slide, I've got a handful of Gothic horror tropes or must-haves that you will find in Gothic literature. And I just want to point out where we see them in The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So in most Gothic horror texts, you will find some element of the supernatural, be that ghosts or witches, or any other supernatural phenomenon. In this case, Jekyll and Hyde being able to split themselves into Jekyll and Hyde and being one in the same person, that is supernatural. That goes beyond the natural, beyond the normal laws of nature. Hyde himself, you could argue, is a supernatural being. Jekyll is the natural being that balances both good and evil. To be able to split yourself and unleash just your evil, that is not natural, and that makes Hyde supernatural, which again fits in the Gothic genre. In Gothic literature, you have a sense of the unknown, a mystery that needs solving. In this case, it is Dr. Jekyll's potion and the science behind it. It's very mysterious. We hear it described as a tincture. We know it bubbles up, it's effervescent. We know it changes colours. We know it uses salts. But none of this actually tells us how to make it, which poses the question, does it already exist? Are people already using it? Remembering in Victorian England at the time, Jack the Ripper was a very famous murder case that remained unsolved. Maybe Jack the Ripper was a respectable gentleman like Dr. Jekyll, who managed to use a potion to split himself and reveal his inner evil, his Mr. Hyde, to do all of that murdering. That would be frightening to a Victorian readership. Madness is an idea that you get in Gothic horror literature. Usually you get a mad scientist who's created something. For example, Frankenstein in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. He creates the monster, Frankenstein's monster. Here we get a mad scientist, in this case Dr. Jekyll, who creates a potion to split himself, good and evil, and unleash his evil. In Gothic horror, you often get secrets. These are used to build tension and suspense, and feelings of tension and suspense are commonly found in Gothic literature. In this case, Stevenson uses letters to build that tension and suspense through hiding secrets and withholding information within those letters. With Gothic horror, you get certain settings. You normally get abandoned, rundown locations, such as Blackmail House, where Jekyll has his laboratory where Hyde stays in. And with Gothic horror, as the name suggests, you get elements of horror, things that shock you and scare you. You get elements of terror, again, things that shock and scare you. In this novella, we get the transformation. That is shocking, that's a horrible thought, and the way Stevenson describes it, it lets the reader use their imagination to fully imagine that horror. And we get some brutal deaths that admittedly are quite terrifying. We get Sir Carew Danvers being murdered, we get suicide at the end of the novella, we get violent actions like a girl being trampled. All of these things would terrify and horrify Victorian readers, and you would expect to be terrified and horrified when reading Gothic horror. So you can put forward a very good case in your essay that The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is both a piece of detective fiction and a piece of fiction that belongs in the Gothic horror genre. Looking at themes, I want to talk a bit about repression and silence. Victorian society was very, very repressive. That means you couldn't express yourself. You had to control your urges and behave in a certain way. This was particularly true for Victorian gentlemen who had to present themselves in a certain way and had to really control any impulses or desires they had, particularly in public. Now, if you oppress and repress someone long enough, you deny them the freedom to express themselves, to do what they want, people tend to get more and more extreme in how they seek relief and in how they express themselves, and it can become more and more violent and more dangerous. Now, Dr. Jekyll was repressed. We learn this in the last chapter, chapter 10, where we read his letter and we learn all about his personality. He had a wild side, but he wasn't able to express it. So he repressed it, he squished it, and eventually it broke free via the potion in the form of Mr. Hyde, with really dangerous and destructive results. Now, the other thing with repression is it also leads to silence. People who are repressed are battling a part of their personality, but it's a part of the personality they might be embarrassed about, so they don't talk about it, which leads to silence and makes the situation worse. Dr. Lanyon could have directly told Mr. Utterson what he witnessed when he witnessed Hyde transform into Jekyll, but in doing so, he risks ruining the reputation of Dr. Jekyll, so he doesn't tell Mr. Utterson, and so tension and suspense is maintained, and the mystery is still not solved. There's a very sort of common stereotype that men are quite good at withholding their emotions and feelings and not communicating them, whereas women are much better at communicating their thoughts and feelings and emotions. And I've always wondered in this novella if Dr. Lanyon, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Utterson just had a good old conversation and expressed their thoughts and feelings, that all of these problems could be solved. But they didn't, and as a result we get a very good suspenseful piece of Gothic literature. Silence is good for suspense in Gothic literature. So if Stevenson made Lanyon, Jekyll and Utterson have a good old conversation and sort out all their problems, this wouldn't be a suspenseful piece of Gothic fiction. This would be some kind of everyday drama. So the silence that was born out of the repression actually adds to the suspense. It adds to the Gothic horror. It creates a sense of isolation, that no one could help these characters, so they went to their own fated paths, to their own destinies. Okay, what key quotes might you want to take away from chapter 6? Man's cruelty, callous and violent, vile life, hatred. All of these phrases have been used to describe Hyde and Hyde's influence. Jekyll, when he had his revival and came back to normal, when he thought he had control over Mr. Hyde, was described as a guest and an entertainer. He was becoming charitable again, which was expected of Victorian gentlemen. He re-engaged with religion, maybe with this good versus evil theme. He wanted to get back on God's good side after releasing an evil upon the world, such as Hyde. The next quotes describe Lanyon. He had a death warrant written legibly upon his face. The rosy man had grown pale, his flesh had fallen away, deep-seated terror of the mind, his days accounted, a doomed man. All of these describe Lanyon after he'd witnessed a transformation. I have a shock and I shall never recover. Lanyon says that about himself, so he knows he's going to die. I cannot tell you. This really indicates that repression and silence and secrecy I mentioned. The characters could solve the murder mystery there and then, but they don't. And that builds the suspense, that builds that Gothic tension. Jekyll says he will live in extreme seclusion from here on out. Again, that sense of isolation and silence. No one can help him. He's on his own. That could be, you could argue, the biggest terror of it all. If I am the chief of sinners, I am the chief of sufferers also. Again, Jekyll acknowledges he's committed a sin with this idea of good versus evil, and particularly that word sin has sort of biblical connotations. And we know that in Victorian England it was a largely Christian society, which you would be expected to do good in. You'd be expected to be a gentleman in. So releasing an evil like Mr. Hyde onto the world, who commits murder, who tramples little girls, maybe there's an element of God punishing Jekyll, and therefore he acknowledges he's the chief of sinners, and if you sin excessively, you will suffer, perhaps ultimately in hell, which poses a very interesting question. Is that where Jekyll belongs? Not to be open till the death or disappearance of Dr. Henry Jekyll, it's that phrasing, death or disappearance, that is what makes Mr. Utterson think back to Dr. Jekyll's will and suspect that Mr. Hyde is involved in this foul play. So, if you want to practice a little bit of writing based on chapter 6, try answering this question. How does Stevenson present the change in Dr. Lanyon? If I was you, I would go back to chapter 2 and see how Dr. Lanyon is presented at the beginning as very happy and healthy and quite genial, quite a nice person to be around. I would then take a look at the transformation and what Dr. Lanyon witnessed. I will then have a look at what Dr. Lanyon, how Dr. Lanyon is presented in chapter 6 and his ultimate death. It is quite a dramatic change. There should be plenty for you to talk about when writing this answer. Of course, make notes from this video on a copy of the novella, so you have all this information accessible for when you revise. If you found this video useful, please like it, consider subscribing to my channel and leave a comment if you think I missed anything out. Thank you for your attention, and I'll see you on the next one.